cardigan, a pair of sneakers, a slow, unhurried hello. From those simple ingredients, Fred Rogers built one of the strangest and most quietly rebellious shows in the history of American television. When it premiered in 1968, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood looked like nothing else on the air. No chases, no pratfalls, no laugh track. Just a man talking directly to children as if they were the most important people in the room. Over more than 3 decades and nearly 1,000 episodes, that gentle format became a cultural institution, shaping the emotional lives of generations who grew up believing, because he told them so, that they were special just the way they are. But underneath the calm surface was a far more interesting story than most people realize. A story involving a civil rights statement disguised as a kiddie pool, a future Hollywood superhero pushing a trolley cart, a gorilla who fell in love with a television host, and a persistent urban legend that simply refused to die no matter how many times it was disproven. Today we're counting down 15 facts about Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood that even lifelong fans of the show might not know. Stick around to the end, because the final fact reframes everything you thought you knew about why this simple children's program became such a radical piece of broadcasting. And if you enjoy going behind the scenes of classic television, consider subscribing. We dig into shows like this every week. In 1969, American television was still terrified of controversy, especially when it came to race. So when Fred Rogers wheeled out a small plastic wading pool and invited Officer Clemens, played by the classically trained singer Francois Clemens, to join him and cool his feet in the water, it looked on the surface like nothing at all. 2 men sitting on a warm afternoon, talking quietly, sharing a towel. But in an era when Black Americans were still being turned away from public swimming pools, sometimes violently, the image of a white host and a black police officer sharing the same small body of water was anything but incidental. Rogers never lectured his audience about what the scene meant. He didn't pause to explain segregation or civil rights to his young viewers. He simply treated the moment as ordinary, which was exactly the point, normalizing what bigotry had spent decades insisting was abnormal. Clemens later spoke about how meaningful the scene was to him personally, given the barriers he had faced as a black performer breaking into television. Rogers revisited the segment years later, quietly reinforcing a message that, sadly, the country still hadn't fully absorbed. It remains one of the most understated acts of protest ever broadcast on a children's program. Long before he was fighting crime in Gotham City, actor Michael Keaton was a young Pittsburgh local trying to break into show business, and one of his earliest jobs was working behind the scenes on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. In the mid-1970s, Keaton was part of the production's floor crew, helping move sets, manage props, and, perhaps most memorably, physically operate the neighborhood trolley that shuttled viewers between the real world and the neighborhood of make-believe. Keaton didn't stay entirely behind the camera, either. He also popped up on screen in a minor comic role during a circus-themed episode. Years later, after Keaton had become a movie star, he spoke fondly about his time working for Rogers, describing him as one of the most consistently kind and genuine people he ever encountered in the entertainment industry, a notable compliment from someone who would go on to work with countless directors, producers, and studios. It's a strange bit of trivia to sit with. The actor who would later embody one of pop culture's darkest vigilantes spent his early career making sure a cardboard trolley hit its mark on cue. For more than 30 years, Fred Rogers maintained the exact same weight, 143 pounds. This wasn't about vanity or fitness trends. It was personal code. Rogers was fond of pointing out that "I love you" breaks down into a simple numerical pattern. 1 letter for I, for letters for love, and 3 letters for you. Adding those numbers together gives you 143. Stepping on the scale every morning wasn't just a health habit for him. It became a private ritual, a small daily reaffirmation of the message he had built his entire career around. While the rest of the country cycled through diet fads and body image anxieties, Rogers turned a mundane act of self-monitoring into something almost meditative. The number meant so much to people who knew the story that the state of Pennsylvania eventually declared May 14th, 1/4/3, as 143 Day, an annual celebration of kindness and community named in his honor. Nearly everyone who grew up watching the show remembers the ritual. Fred Rogers walks through the door, hangs up his blazer, slips into a hand-knit cardigan, and swaps his dress shoes for a pair of soft canvas sneakers, all while singing the show's famous opening number. It became one of the most comforting transitions in the history of children's television, a visual cue that signaled, now it's just you and me. But the origin of the sneakers wasn't symbolic at all. It was a technical necessity. The studio floor amplified the sound of hard-soled shoes so badly that Rogers' footsteps were interfering with the audio recording, turning quiet, intimate scenes into an accidental percussion track. Switching to soft sneakers solved the problem instantly. What began as a sound engineering fix eventually took on much larger meaning. Watching Rogers change his shoes became a signal to children that the noisy, hurried outside world was being left at the door, replaced by someone who was slowing down specifically to pay attention to them. The neighborhood of make-believe was populated by a surprisingly large cast of characters. The pompous, self-important King Friday 13, the anxious and gentle Daniel Striped Tiger, the chaotic and rule-breaking Lady Elaine Fairchild, and dozens of others. What most viewers never realized was that nearly all of these characters were voiced by one person, Fred Rogers himself. Rather than hiring a large ensemble of voice actors, Rogers performed the vast majority of the puppet characters, shifting his pitch, cadence, and personality to bring each one to life. This wasn't just a budget-saving decision. It gave him an unusual outlet. Through timid Daniel Striped Tiger, he could express vulnerability and fear. Through the blustering King Friday, he could explore stubbornness and control. Through Lady Elaine, he could indulge mischief and rebellion. In effect, an entire imaginary society was being generated from the emotional range of a single, extraordinarily disciplined performer. And most children in the audience had no idea they were listening to one man's internal chorus. Those iconic zip-up cardigans weren't costume department creations. They were made by Fred Rogers' mother, Nancy, who knitted each one by hand and gave them to her son as personal gifts. Season after season, viewers were watching Rogers wear garments crafted specifically for him by the same hands that had raised him. When Nancy Rogers passed away in 1981, the supply of hand-knit sweaters stopped, leaving the production with an oddly sentimental wardrobe problem. How do you replace something so deeply tied to family history? By that point, the sweaters were inseparable from who Rogers was on screen. Warmth, consistency, and quiet devotion, quite literally woven into fabric. One of the original cardigans is now preserved in the Smithsonian's collection, an object that, on paper, is just a piece of clothing, but in reality carries the story of a mother's care extending far beyond her own home. In 1998, Fred Rogers visited Coco, the famous gorilla known for her ability to communicate using American Sign Language. Coco had reportedly watched recordings of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood many times before the meeting took place. When Rogers entered her enclosure, something remarkable happened. Coco approached him, gently removed his shoes, mimicking the show's signature ritual, and then wrapped him in a hug, signing the word love. It's a moment that sounds almost too perfect to be real, but it was captured on camera and widely reported at the time. Setting aside questions researchers still debate about the extent of Coco's language comprehension, the interaction demonstrated something simple and striking. An animal who had only ever experienced Rogers through a screen still recognized the emotional core of what he represented. Safety, gentleness, trust. If a gorilla could pick up on that from recorded footage alone, it says something about just how consistent and legible Rogers' persona truly was. For decades, a bizarre urban legend followed Fred Rogers around. The idea that the soft-spoken television host was secretly a former Marine or Navy SEAL sniper with a hidden combat record, supposedly wearing long sleeves specifically to conceal tattoos earned during his military service. It's the kind of story that thrived in the pre-internet era of schoolyard whispers, repeated so often and so confidently that many people simply assumed it had to be true. It wasn't. Fred Rogers never served in the armed forces. During the years young American men were commonly being drafted, he was pursuing seminary studies and beginning to develop his ideas about how television could be used to support children emotionally, not enlisting for combat. Some researchers believe the rumor may have originated from confusion with another man who shared his name and did have a military background. Others suspect it grew simply because audiences found it hard to believe that someone could be that consistently kind without some darker secret underneath. The myth says a lot less about Fred Rogers than it does about a culture that's often more comfortable imagining hidden violence than accepting open sincerity. Underneath the show's calm dialogue and puppet scenes was a surprisingly sophisticated musical foundation. Instead of using pre-recorded stock music, the production employed a live jazz trio, led by pianist Johnny Costa, a musician so technically gifted that colleagues sometimes refer to him as the Bach of children's television. Costa and his trio improvised transitions, mood cues, and background scoring in real time during tapings, responding instinctively to the pacing of each scene as it unfolded. For young viewers, the effect was simple. The music just felt right, whether it was a warm chord under a comforting conversation or a playful run accompanying a puppet's entrance. But musically literate adults could recognize genuine jazz complexity happening underneath a show built for preschoolers. While most children's programming of the era leaned on cheap, repetitive stock cues to save money and time, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood treated its score almost like another character, one capable of conveying feelings that dialogue alone couldn't reach. Fred Rogers refused to let his fame become an abstraction. In an era before email, he committed himself to reading and responding to the flood of fan mail the show received, often working alongside his longtime assistant to keep pace. On an average day, that could mean 15 to 30 letters, some describing ordinary days, others revealing genuine grief, fear, or family hardship. Rather than relying on form letters or pre-written responses, Rogers engaged with the substance of what children actually wrote to him, treating each note as a real conversation rather than fan mail to be processed and filed away. In an industry built almost entirely around one-to-many broadcasting, Rogers carved out enormous amounts of personal time for one-to-one correspondence. For a child who received an envelope back in his own handwriting, the neighborhood on the screen suddenly felt a lot closer to home. Fred Rogers didn't set out to build a puppet-filled fantasy world because he loved puppets. He entered television because he hated what it was already doing to children. In the early 1950s, children's programming leaned heavily on slapstick comedy. Pies to the face, exaggerated pratfalls, humiliation played strictly for laughs, often with little regard for how young viewers actually processed what they were seeing. Rogers reportedly found the format genuinely troubling. Rather than dismissing television as a lost cause, he decided the better move was to enter the medium himself and try building something fundamentally different. The unhurried pacing, thoughtful silences, and calm explanations that came to define Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood weren't accidental quirks. They were a deliberate rejection of the chaos he'd witnessed on other channels. In many ways, the show functioned as a quiet, sustained protest against an entire industry's assumptions about what would keep kids watching. In 1963, the Presbyterian Church ordained Fred Rogers as a minister, but with an unusual assignment. Rather than placing him in charge of a traditional congregation, the church encouraged him to pursue his ministry through television, focusing specifically on the emotional and spiritual well-being of children. Rogers rarely referenced theology directly on the show, and he avoided anything resembling formal religious doctrine. Instead, his ministry expressed itself through recurring themes of self-worth, patience, forgiveness, and compassion, communicated in language simple enough for a 4-year-old to fully understand. Every episode treated its audience not as a marketing demographic, but as individuals with real inner lives worth taking seriously. In a very real sense, the television studio functioned as his chapel, the camera as his pulpit, and the audience at home as a congregation he never physically met but clearly still cared for. In 1983, As international tensions and news coverage of conflict saturated American media, Fred Rogers made an unusual choice for a preschool program. He addressed the subject of war directly, rather than pretending young children weren't already absorbing frightening headlines and adult conversations around them. Through a multi-episode arc set in the neighborhood of make-believe, characters grappled openly with fear, misunderstanding, and the temptation to answer threats with more threats. The episodes didn't sanitize the topic into meaninglessness, but they also avoided graphic or traumatizing detail, instead giving children a framework for processing frightening news with empathy rather than panic. It was a considerable risk for a show aimed at very young viewers. Plenty of producers would have simply steered clear of the subject altogether. Rogers apparently believed his audience deserved honest engagement with difficult realities, delivered with the reassurance and guidance that only a trusted adult figure could provide. One of the most recognizable images from the show is Fred Rogers' bright red cardigan. It appears on posters in museum displays and in the memories of nearly everyone who grew up watching him. What's rarely mentioned is that Rogers was red-green colorblind, meaning the exact hue that became his visual trademark likely appeared muted or uncertain to him personally. There's something quietly fitting about that detail. While plenty of television productions obsess over color palettes and merchandising potential, Rogers chose his sweaters for entirely different reasons: comfort, familiarity, and the simple fact that his mother had made them. The emotional resonance viewers attached to the red sweater was something the audience supplied through their own eyes and memories, not something Rogers engineered visually. It's a small irony that underscores a much larger truth about the show. Its power rarely depended on surface-level design. It came from intention. Taken individually, none of these facts seem particularly dramatic. A pool, a pair of sneakers, a knitted sweater. But stacked together, they reveal something more interesting. Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood wasn't just a gentle, low-budget children's program that happened to last for decades. It was a sustained, quiet act of resistance against almost every assumption the television industry had about what would hold a child's attention. In a media landscape that equated excitement with volume and value with spectacle, Fred Rogers built a half-hour space where vulnerability was treated with respect, feelings were named instead of dismissed, and difficult topics, racism, death, divorce, disability, war, were addressed honestly rather than avoided. He never chased ratings with gimmicks, never pushed merchandise on his young audience the way so many contemporaries did, and never sped up his pacing just because the rest of television was accelerating around him. Instead, he bet that patience, honesty, and consistency could hold a child's attention just as effectively as any chase scene or pratfall. And for more than 30 years, he was right. That's the real twist hiding behind 15 shocking facts. None of them are shocking because Fred Rogers was hiding something dark. They're shocking because in the middle of an industry built on speed and spectacle, one man's stubborn, unglamorous commitment to slowness and sincerity turned out to be the most radical programming decision television had ever seen. So which of these facts caught you most off guard? Was it the secret meaning behind his weight, the gorilla who recognized him instantly, or the civil rights statement hidden inside a plastic pool? Let us know in the comments, and if you enjoyed this trip back to the neighborhood, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who grew up believing, because a man in a cardigan told them so, that they really were special, just the way they are. End of script.